Good morning, all of you. We will continue with Mother's Day. We have done till page 48, right? Okay, who is
Yes,
the
ma'am.
main character of this play? Main character?
Annie Pearson.
Annie Pearson. Okay, what is the plot? What is this play
Ma'am,
about?
it is a humorous play and it sheds light on the life of women of that time,
Mm-hmm.
and they used to do all the work but still the family members misbehaved with her.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And ma'am, afterwards the story continues.
All right. So, it is a humorous portrayal of the status of a mother in the family. That, she runs around each one, all right, taking the orders, doing what they want, and still, no one respects her or shows any concern. And so, the basic plot is that Mrs. Annie Pearson, who is the chief protagonist, she talks to her neighbor, Mrs. Fitzgerald, and then Mrs. Fitzgerald asks that you need to stand up for yourself, and you need to take a stand against your family and now teach them all a lesson. And so Mrs. Annie Pearson, though she wants a change in her family, but because she is of a timid personality, and she's a very nervous kind of woman, so she's like, she tells her neighbor and friend that even if I promise with you, make a promise, I won't be able to fulfill that promise, I won't be able to keep my word. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, okay, then I have to do it for you. And what she meant was that they change their bodies, and so they hold hands, and they utter and they chant a month, and then their spirits interchange. And now Mrs. Annie Pearson, with Mrs. Fitzgerald's spirit, now she is teaching the family members a lesson. So first there's an interaction with Doris, who comes in first, then with Cyril, and lastly George Pearson, who is the husband, he comes in. Okay, so we were doing that, and yes, all that we have done. And so the last thing that we did was that when Mrs. Annie Pearson, she says to her husband that if you shout at me, George Pearson, then I will slap your face. And to that Mrs. Fitzgerald, she's like, oh, no, 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 please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Again she forgets that she is in Mrs. Fitzgerald body, and so she cannot call the other woman as Mrs. Fitzgerald, because right now, to all the others, she is Mrs. Fitzgerald. And so George, he's bewildered, he's confused, he's like, either I am off my mind, either I have gone crazy, or both of you are crazy. And he asked that, what do you mean? And no, 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 miss, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And he says that you yourself are Mrs. Fitzgerald, all right, and you are not doing anything, so why you are stopping yourself? And in reality, you tell her to stop, means you tell my wife to stop, and then only there'll be some sense in it. And then he stares at Mrs. Pearson and says that, I think you must be tiddly, means I think you are slightly drunk now. And to that again, Mrs. Pearson, she starts and says, say that again, George Pearson. And now George, he is threatened, and he's like, all right, all right, all right, means I'm not saying anything. And then on that, Doris, she enters from the left, and she's looking miserable. Why is Doris looking so miserable? Yes.
Because she had cried and her mother has scolded her.
Okay, all right. Because she said about Charlie Spence that even I will not be caught dead with Charlie Spence, and he has got buck teeth and he is half-witted, and that is why she is crying. And the way, basically, it was not what she said, but the way she said, that made Doris cry. And so Doris, she has been crying because mother has treated her so, and never in life before Mrs. Annie Pearson has talked to her family members like that, and that is why Doris was crying. And so she is still wearing that wrap, because earlier she said that she had to go out with Charlie Spence, and so she's still wearing the wrap. And Mrs. Pearson, she comes and sits on the settee on which Mrs. Uh, means Mrs. Pearson, she was already sitting on the settee. And because when George made her angry, she gets up to shout at him, but again she sits back. And then Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says to Doris that, hello Doris. So she also replied to the pleasantry as, hello Mrs. Fitzgerald. So she says that, I thought that you were going out with Charlie Spence. See, again and again, Mrs. Annie Pearson, who is in the body of Mrs. Fitzgerald, she forgets that she is not in her own body. She is in the body of Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is just a neighbor. So obviously, she cannot ask such personal questions. And so when she says that, I thought you were going out with Charlie Spence tonight, so Doris, she gets annoyed at that, and she says that, what is that to do with you? Means, why are you worried? Why are you asking that? And so Mrs. Pearson, sharply, she scolds her, says, stop that. So Mrs. Fitzgerald is like, no, no, it's all right. So Mrs. Pearson, she severely cuts in and says, no, it's not all right. And I don't want to have a daughter who talks like that to other people. And then she scolds Doris and says, okay, now you answer Mrs. Fitzgerald in a proper manner, and if you are not able to talk properly, then it is better you go upstairs. And so Doris, she looks at her father, means, see what is happening, mother and all. And George, in despair, now he has lost all hope, and he's like, don't look at me, I give up. I just give it up, means now I cannot do anything about it, and I just give up. And so Mrs. Pearson, she's on that only, and she tells Doris, well, answer her. And so she doesn't want to answer, but then she's like, I was going out with she tells that she was going out with Charlie Spence, but then she has called off. Now she is not going. So Mrs. Fitzgerald is like, oh, that's a pity, dear, that's so sad. Why you are not going out? And that, again, Doris, with a flash of temper, she's like, because. And then she says, now if you really want to know, though it is none of your business, but if you really want to know, my mother, she is going on at me, making me feel miserable. Me making means she is in the process of making me. Means, and then she says, okay, because, and if you really need to know, then my mother, she is making me miserable, and she is saying that he has got buck teeth and is half-witted. Buck teeth, I told you what does buck teeth means? Does anyone remember? What is buck teeth? Yes? Any idea? All right. Some people, they have their front teeth to wide
Bulge
awake.
now.
Yes, and they come down, protrude till your lower lips. So that is what she said, that he has got buck teeth and he's half-witted. Means he's a very foolish person. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, though otherwise she is a very timid lady and nervous kind of personality she has, but now rather boldly she says to Mrs. Pearson, oh, you shouldn't have said that. And to that Mrs. Pearson, she replies, Mrs. Fitzgerald, I will manage my family, you simply manage yours. And so George, he's like, now taking her off, are you, Annie? Means now you are on to her also. And so Mrs. Pearson, she is even more grim, sad, and says that, and again, she's again taunting her husband, says that they are waiting for you at the club. George, don't forget, they are waiting for you at the club. And then she says to Doris, and Doris, now you don't again start crying. And now Mrs. Fitzgerald, she makes a sudden decision, and then she gets up and says, that's enough, quite enough. And to that, George and Doris both look at her bewildered. They are surprised and shocked. Means, what she has got to do with all this? A neighbor coming in, and your family, are in disagreement and confusion, and basically a little bit of fighting is going on. And then she stands up and says, okay, that's enough. And so obviously, both of them, they stared at her like, what is wrong with you? And then, Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says to George and Doris that, now listen, you two, and I want to have a private talk with Mrs. Fritz. She was just going to say Mrs. Fitzgerald, but then she corrects herself and says with Mrs. Pearson, and then I'll be obliged if both of you just leave us alone for a few minutes. And she says, and when we are done, means when I have had a talk with her, then I will let you know. And then she pleads them, okay, please go on. And she says that I will promise you that you are not going to regret this. And then she says that there's something that only I can deal with. To that, George, he rises and says, I am glad that somebody can deal with it, cause I can't. and so he says that okay, at least somebody can deal with it because I can't. And then he calls Doris that okay, come on Doris. And so George and Doris, they both exit from the left door, and as they go, so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she moves to the left of the small table, that small table which was in the center, and she moves there and she sits, and then she eagerly beckons Mrs. Pearson to do the same thing. She asks her also to come and sit there. Mrs. Fitzgerald, now she says, Mrs. Fitzgerald, we must change back now. We really must. Now, in Mrs. Fitzgerald's body, we have Mrs. Annie Pearson's spirit, and so that is why she's calling Mrs. Annie Pearson, who has Mrs. Fitzgerald's spirit, as Mrs. Fitzgerald, and says that okay, now we must change back. We really must. So Mrs. Pearson, she rises from where she was sitting on the settee, and she's like, why? And so Mrs. Fitzgerald says that because all this has gone too far, and all of them are so miserable, and I can't bear to see them like that. And so Mrs. Pearson, she says that I think a little bit of this more, it won't do them any harm, and it will only do them good. And already I have made a big difference today. And then still saying that, she moves to the right of the table and she sits. So but Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, but I can't stand it all anymore, I can take it all anymore, and I really can't. And then she says okay, now we must change places again, we must change back. And she says okay, hurry up please Mrs. Fitzgerald, because now I can't bear it all anymore, and now we need to change back. And so Mrs. Pearson is like, well, okay, if you insist. So Mrs. Fitzgerald says, yes, I do. Please, please. So she pleads, and so she stretches her hands across the table, and Mrs. Pearson, she takes them, and so Mrs. Pearson asks her, okay, quiet now, relax. And then both of them, they stare at each other just like in the beginning of the play. They mutter exactly as they did before, arasta dam, arasta lam, arasta lam dam bona. And then they carry out the same action as they did before, and they simply go lax as if no life is there in their bodies. And then again they come to life, and but this time, of course, they become their proper personalities. That now Mrs. Annie Pearson has her own spirit, and Mrs. Fitzgerald has her own spirit. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald is like, well, I enjoyed that. Means she being in Mrs. Annie Pearson's body, she really enjoyed it. And so Mrs. Pearson is like, but I didn't. So Mrs. Fitzgerald is like, well, you ought to have done, means you ought to have enjoyed. And then she says, okay, now you listen, Mrs. Pearson. Now you don't be soft and then again. And else, otherwise it will all be wasted. So now don't be so soft on them, because otherwise it will be of no use. And so Mrs. Pearson is like, I'll try not to, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says that they didn't have all this treatment for as long as I wanted them to have. Maybe another hour or two, maybe 1 or 2 hours more rough treatment. If they have got 1 or 2 more hours rough treatment, then obviously now this would have made certain that now they would have learned to stay in their places. And so Mrs. Pearson is like, I'm sure they'll do better now. And then she says, but I don't know how will I explain all this to them. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, very severely, she says, don't you start explaining or apologizing or whatever for what you have done. Means now don't start that you go on explaining, oh, this happened because of this and I did this because of this. She says, oh no, don't do that. And so Mrs. Pearson, now with spirit, she is like, it's all right for you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Means it is okay for you to say, and after all, obviously they are not your children and your husband. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, impressively, she says, now you listen to me. And you yourself admitted that you have spoiled them, and that they don't appreciate you, that they don't respect you, neither they appreciate you, neither they show you any concern. And so if you give any explanation, any apology, then you will be straight back where you were. Then if you do that, then again you will be back to square one. We'll be back from where we began. And so she says, I am warning you. You just simply give them a look, talk less. Just give them a look, a tone of voice now and again to suggest you might be tough with them. And so she says, okay, don't talk a lot of with them. Just give them a stern glance, or a tone of voice little harsh, and then now and again you simply do that just to suggest that you will again be tough with them if you wanted to, and then I think it will work. And she says, okay, anyway, we can test it also. So Mrs. Pearson is like that, how? So she says, well, uh, what is it you'd like to do that they don't do? Stop at home for once. So she asked that, okay, what do you want them to do for you? That they otherwise they don't do, but what you want them to do today? And so what do you want, that they should stay at home today? And so Mrs. Pearson is like, yes, I would like that, and also that give me a hand with supper, that they should also help me in the preparation of supper. So Mrs. Fitzgerald is like, anything you would like them to do that you enjoy, whether they do or not. So, and then she says, okay, anything else that you want them to do? Something, maybe something you enjoy, but they don't enjoy. What do you want them to do? So, she hesitates and says, well, yes, I like to have a nice game of rummy. But then she says, but of course, I hardly ever get time to play that, only except at Christmas. Means only at Christmas when they all are at home, then only I get to play rummy, otherwise I never get a chance. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she gets up and says, okay, that will do now. Then, and so she moves towards the door which is on the left, and again she says, but remember, keep firm, or you've had it. Means now remember, you need to keep firm, otherwise it will be of no use. And then she opens the door and she calls that, hoy, you all can come in right now. And so she comes away from the door and moves slightly right and says quietly, but remember, a firm hand. So now she is calling in back the family, and so she again and again she just tells her, okay, you be firm, remember, don't forget, otherwise it will be of no use. And so George, Doris and Cyril, they come through the doorway and they are looking like at Mrs. Pearson. Means now what to expect. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, on that, she says, okay, I'm just off, means I'm going now, and all of you can enjoy yourself. And so the family, very worriedly, anxiously, they look at Mrs. Pearson, and she smiles. And when she smiles, so all of them are much relieved, and they also smile back at her. So Doris, anxiously, she asks, yes, mother? And Mrs. Pearson, smiling, she says that, seeing that you don't want to go out, I tell you what I thought we do. So she says that now, knowing that you people won't be going out, then I want to tell you that what we should do. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she again, she gives a final warning and says, remember. And then Mrs. Pearson, she nods, and then she looks sharply again, with that same attitude at her family, and she says, no objections, I hope. And so George, humbly, yes, okay, whatever you say. And Mrs. Pearson, she smiles and she says that, I think that we will have a nice family game of rummy, and then you children also later on can get the and you children can get the supper ready while I have a talk with your father. So that was what her plan, that they should have a nice game of rummy. The children, they prepare the supper while she has a talk with her husband. So George, he says firmly, okay, suits me, means I don't have any problem. And then he looks at the children in a challenging way, means what about you? And so Cyril hastily, he says that, yes, that's all right, means okay, I'm ready. And Doris, she is still hesitating, well, I so Mrs. Pearson sharply says, what, speak up. And so Doris is like, oh, I think it would be lovely. And Mrs. Pearson, she smiles and says, goodbye, Mrs. Fitzgerald, come again soon. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, yes, dear, night all, means she wishes them good night and have a nice time. And then Mrs. Fitzgerald, she exits from the left, and the family, they cluster around mother, and the curtain falls. Okay, so that was the play, and the family, they learnt their lesson well. So how did you find the play?
Nice.
Okay, did you all
I
like
mean, it
it?
was a long play. It was a long play, but the content was as such, it kept us hooked to the play.
Right, though it was quite long, but still it was quite interesting, yes. And have you all understood? Is there anything which is still, a little confusing, or like that? Yes? Is it clear to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Vinayak?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Okay. So for today, we'll stop here. And when we meet again, then we will discuss the question answers.